Do you think that this conflict is getting worse in terms of the future of this conflict, in terms of the relationship between two superpowers, Russia and the United States? How do you find the current situation of the conflict in Ukraine?
The stakes were very high to begin with, because in response to Russia, the West pulled out all the stops, at first rhetorically, but then to fulfill its rhetorical commitment, especially after the failed peace negotiations in Istanbul, when Boris Johnson publicly encouraged the Ukrainian leader Zelensky to fight, as he put it, let's fight rather than negotiate a settlement. That in response to that, they then put themselves on a track to keep funding. And it is very clear, a lot of analysts have pointed out that the West has increasingly over time shifted the goalposts. So things that were not acceptable to ship to Ukraine, certain types of weapons, now it's all right. And before it was this type of long-range missile, and then it was the F-16s, and then something else. So it is clear that having committed rhetorically the West to supporting Ukraine's victory over Russia, it now has to fulfill that commitment in terms of the kind of weaponry and assistance that it provides, or be seen as betraying Ukraine. And in fact, because there are many members of NATO, especially in the western half of the alliance, the older half of the alliance, that worry about escalation, seemingly much more than some of the newer members, that in fact, the net result is a policy of equivocation, which is frustrating to Ukraine, and eventually, I suspect, will have to lead them to ask the question publicly, even more than they have to date, of whether the United States is and the rest of Europe is really fully behind them. This issue is now already being openly discussed in the Ukrainian press. What is the strategy of the West with respect to Ukraine? Is it to simply bleed Russia and to use Ukrainians as the instrument for doing so? Or is it to support Ukraine ultimately toward victory in this fight with Russia? And if it's the former, then the only people who will come out losing ultimately from this kind of stalemate situation, or even potentially Russian victory, if it lasts long enough, probably, and Western aid is insufficient, the only losers ultimately are the Ukrainians themselves. And why should they go along with this? It doesn't then strategically make sense. But there doesn't appear to be a serious enough commitment on the part of the West to actual Ukrainian victory. And there are many reasons possibly for that.
Do you think in their mind, in the Biden administration, do they really think that Ukraine has a chance to win this conflict, or even have a stalemate in Ukraine? If you look at the financial aid, you look at the weapons that the West have been sending to Ukraine during the last 2 years. In 2023, these aids were reduced by 40%. It's huge when it comes to this conflict. And besides that, you have the casualties on the part of Ukrainians. And right now, it seems that the Congress in the United States is not totally in for sending more aids to Ukraine. In your opinion, is this a political game for the Biden administration to continue this war?
So the first part of your question is there a belief in the possibility of victory? No. I don't think that there is that belief in the corridors of power in Washington or in Brussels or in NATO, well, NATO headquarters in Brussels, or the EU. That doesn't make sense because the public perception in Europe is now no more than 10% believe that Ukraine has a chance to win. About twice as many believe Russia is more likely to win, and the majority in the middle believe there's likely to be some sort of compromise or stalemate. I would distinguish in terms of the future between the period before the election and the period after the American election. So in the period before the American election in November, nothing can change in Washington. The Biden administration has a long history, too long history at this point, of committing to a certain perspective and a certain policy on Ukraine, and it could do nothing to change that without simply appearing inconsistent and damaging its electoral prospects as a result. So it is literally handcuffed to this policy. It cannot escape from it. But it is the nature of the American political process that after an election, the new president redefines the policy, and however he's going to define the policy has to be somehow different from the past. So what is he going to do? What is his vision going to be? What is his administration? What innovations is his administration going to introduce? And that's one aspect of why there will be a change. And the second aspect is that the second administration is the last administration, if it happens to be Biden. So he is in essence given a freer hand as we call it a lame duck president, someone who doesn't have to worry about getting reelected. That sort of president has an opportunity to think longer term. So under those conditions, I think the opportunities to change policy become much more realistic. And I think that's in fact what is going to happen. But no matter what happens on the ground in Russia, in this fight before November, I don't think the Biden administration can respond in any other way but to at least rhetorically support Ukraine to the hilt. That doesn't mean, however, that any particular resources, financial or military, have to be released. That, in any case, is a 6 month process to years. I would say, in effect, if you look at the actual expenditure of military resources, it has been the strategy of the United States over the last 2 years to gradually shrink those and to consciously make the effort to ascertain which of these resources is the most appropriate and how to keep control of those resources in order to influence Ukrainian policy in a way that is most advantageous to the United States. I was just reading a piece before we got online. I didn't get to the end of it, but it essentially argued that the White House is very angry now with the Ukraine over their latest claimed success, namely the third largest oil refinery in Ukraine being targeted. And the reason is because if, as a result of that, in 2 or 3 months, oil prices at the gas pump in the United States rise dramatically, the reason will be, critics will be able to point to these Ukrainian strikes. And the blame for this will be put on the Biden administration and he will have a harder time getting reelected. So they're not interested in promoting Ukrainian morale. They are interested first and last in getting through this election with Biden reelected.
One of the very important characters in the Biden administration was Victoria Nuland. She was responsible for this policy in Ukraine for more than a decade. Recently, she resigned. Some people believe that she was fired. Some people believe that she resigned. Has it changed anything when it comes to Ukraine in the Biden administration?
So to start from the end, I don't think it will change policy, because policy is not made by government officials. It is executed by government officials. And Victoria Nuland, I think, was, I think I described her in one broadcast recently, podcast, as not the executor of policy, not the person coming up with the ideas, but actually the person who carried it out. She no doubt was an enthusiastic executor of policies that she believed in. But if she were told to, if she had been told, I should say, to wrap up support now, because we are shifting our emphasis away from Ukraine and toward other areas, that's what she would have done. Some people argue that that is one reason why she resigned. It's probably a combination of factors. One of them being that there's no higher position for her to aspire to in the State Department, other than the person in charge as Deputy Secretary of State or Secretary of State, to a larger oversight over all of U.S. foreign policy. But that would then have taken her interests away from Ukraine. Ukraine would have had to been given as a portfolio to someone else. The way most people, or many people, see her resignation is that there was an internal battle in the Biden administration over the direction of foreign policy as we presumably enter Biden's second term in office. And should it be focused on Europe and Ukraine, or should it be focused on containing the rising threat of China? And the choice to go with Kurt Campbell as promoting him instead of promoting Victoria Nuland was seen as a choice to emphasize China over Russia as a threat. And so she decided, given her seniority, given her age, given the priority shifting, probably that now is as good a time as any to enter the private sector, which again is not uncommon for people at that level, and to have more time to think and reflect on broad strategy, to write a book about it maybe. So that's what I think happened in that regard. And I don't see anything changing, because someone else, again, will be given the task of promoting an American policy on Ukraine, which, again, as I said, has been in the works and been more or less consistent, I would argue, since 2014, maybe even earlier, since 2008 in the invasion of Georgia. It's simply been expanded and gone to its logical conclusion, one of hostility toward Russia, and ultimately perhaps the reestablishment of a broad containment strategy toward Russia, as was recently described in an article in Foreign Affairs magazine, our leading foreign policy publication. Interestingly, though, this attempt to reinvigorate containment is not only aimed at Russia, but is now aimed at containing both Russia and China simultaneously, which makes it, I think, pretty far-fetched to me.
The other thing that we've seen so far in France, and considering the behavior of Emmanuel Macron, he said we're prepared to send our troops, the NATO troops, to Ukraine. And we've seen that Bloomberg was criticizing him for this type of behavior, for this type of comments that he has made. And Europeans were totally in disagreement with him. What's his strategy, in your opinion?
I don't think he has a consistent strategy. Having anyone who observes him for a number of years can see that he throws out ideas, sometimes that are completely contradictory, to see which one of them would build his reputation in Europe as an original thinker and a leader. And this seems to be something along those lines. And very quickly, I should say, it received such a negative reaction from so many important voices in the European Union that he very quickly walked it back through his advisors and said, well, what we're actually talking about is only not actual troops, certainly not engaging in fighting, but advisors and things like that. And maybe they could help to replace forces in who are not on the front line, so that Ukraine could have more fighting forces, things like that. But even that, I think, is extremely risky, because any equipment or personnel, acknowledged or not, that is in Ukraine, as the Russians have said, they consider a legitimate military target. And that would certainly apply to any troops. And it's just inconceivable to me that if a large contingent, several hundred even, troops were sent to any one place, that they would not be engaged in the conflict and be considered a legitimate enemy combatant by the Russians, and could be wiped out by, one well-placed missile. So I can't, it would be extremely foolish to put your own forces in that circumstance, especially since there are many French generals, and you can find their names, French and Swiss, on the internet, who have, in fact, pointed out that the sending of any sort of contingent of this sort at this point, which would never be that large to begin with, would in fact not change the outcome on the battlefield. That the process, this is one of the things I've come to appreciate as someone who's reading about military strategy, but not in fact a specialist in it myself, that the time that it takes to have a military outcome is months. In other words, there needs to be logistical preparation. There needs to be the placing appropriately of forces at the front line, on the second line. The reinforcements need to be considered. All of the proper conditions for transportation need to be considered. And that the outcome that we're seeing today on the battlefield, the rise of the advance of Russian forces and the retreat of the Ukrainian forces, was prepared months ago. And what we're seeing now is the outcome of those decisions. So what proper military strategists can do is say, look at the supply chain, look at the way in which the forces are being reinforced, look at the economic and military potential of both sides. And from that, you can deduce what the military outcome is likely to be 6 months from now. And that's why you have more and more military people concluding that this war militarily looks like it is actually winding down. It is leading toward a military, a one-sided military outcome in favor of Russia. And the only question is whether this can be staved off to a certain extent, delayed by additional resources that are funded now, which might come be in the pipeline and usable over the next several months to slow down the Russian advance, or whether this will in fact be a collapse. That's something you can't predict because it has to do with morale and certain unforeseen aspects of an actual battle. But the strategy, the military outcome seems to be less and less in doubt. And what we are seeing in the West is political commentators and politicians who refuse to accept that or to consider that, which I think is ultimately self-defeating, or who have basically accepted that, but are not sure how to spin it in the public, since they were originally supporters of Ukrainian victory and now do not know, have no viable strategy for walking that back. Luckily, again, their problems will be resolved in the United States in November. In other words, everything in American politics right now, including the entire war in Ukraine, doesn't matter. It all crystallizes, and the outcome must be focused on the political outcome for the United States of the November election, after which all of these realities can be reconsidered and evaluated anew. And that's one of the paradoxical and bizarre things about American politics, is that in this time of heat, literally a frenzy in American politics, nothing else in the world matters. It's only about the internal battle in Washington.
There is an article in Financial Times recently. They're talking about wars in Ukraine and Middle East, boost orders at German defense supplier. They're talking about that the German military industrial complex is getting a lot of benefit from the war in Ukraine and Gaza. Do you think that they're trying to push the German economy toward military technologies?
Well, as you point out, the effective subsidies for German industry that access to cheap Russian raw materials, including gas, have been able to provide. In addition to that, it was a core part of Germany's strategy to be the distribution hub for the rest of Europe for this gas from Europe. This is in crisis. The current German government has turned its back on Russia as a partner. But this is a debated issue, the degree to which Germany should do this and can afford to do this. This is not a popular strategy in the former German Democratic Republic. And it is the predominant view currently in the Social Democratic Party, the ruling party, but there are other voices as well. I therefore am not at all certain that it is a policy, this policy of breaking with Russia permanently can be sustained through the next election. There will be a number of signposts that could lead to a reevaluation, including interim elections, including the upcoming European Parliament elections. If we see a rise in the prominence and popularity of political forces and candidates that are arguing for peace, that would be one indication. I think that's likely to occur. Another is, however, there are even more radical voices in Germany on the right and the left spectrum of German politics that would argue for, in fact, a policy of renewal of relations and friendship with Russia, and a way of defanging Russia's threat by including it in a larger European security arrangement. So there are two, if you will, peace strands in Germany that together, if they received many more voices than they have now, could pose a serious threat to the German political establishment and undermine the current policy, which I would describe as follows. In the face of the threat of deindustrialization and the fall of German industrial production, to indeed requalify industrialization as remilitarization. But that can't happen overnight. That will take years. And the benefits of that remilitarization will only be seen in the years after that remilitarization has taken place. So it is a complicated process that, unfortunately, for the ruling coalition today in Germany, they will not see the fruits of, because they are the ones that have to begin this policy, which is a costly policy of retooling German industry for military production. And the social benefits of that, the technological benefits, will be less than what German industry has traditionally received from civilian industrialization. And therefore, it'll be a hard sell in Germany. And again, these are this type of industry will not obviously benefit from access to cheap Russian raw materials. And the United States has no intention of selling these goods, these commodities to Germany at a discount. The whole discussion on this side of the ocean is Germany and the European allies as a whole should be paying more than they have been for their own defense. And that's true both of Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Makes no difference there.
Recently, we had a terrorist attack in Russia, and Russian officials are putting the blame on the West, that they're talking about that the West was behind this terrorist attack. And at the same time, we've seen no negotiations between Russians and the United States to talk about these serious issues that are happening right now. We have this conflict, we have these type of terrorist activities, we have the conflict in Ukraine, we have the conflict in Taiwan. And if something happens in Taiwan, we cannot imagine that Russia gonna stay aside and say, no, that's not my fight. We know that China stood next to Russia in this conflict in Ukraine, and they're gonna support China if something happens in Taiwan. There are increasing tensions in Gaza and in Syria between Russia and the United States. We have this problem in Africa, that African countries, Senegal just recently said that France has to leave our country. When you look at this situation right now, do you see for the future, do you see something like a new Cold War? It's going to be worse than that. It's going to be a combination of Cold War together with hot war, having some terrorist attacks. How do you see the future of these activities when we see no future for negotiations, for some sort of compromise and cooperation between Russia, China, and the United States?
Well, the Cold War originally referred to a spectrum of relations that existed from essentially 1945, the latter half of 1945, I would say from the Potsdam Conference, to the end of the 1980s, so let's say roughly 1990, 1991. And over this course of time, there were moments of sharp confrontation. There was the There were proxy wars in which the Soviet Union engaged on one side and the United States on the other. There were, however, other periods of the Cold War during which we sought closer relations, we sought cooperation on matters of international importance. We signed major strategic arms treaties, including not just the limitation of arms, but the reduction of arms. We forged cooperation in space, and we had periods of détente. All of this characterizes the old Cold War. Looking toward the future, I think that's the best that we can hope for in the new Cold War. The thing that makes it the new Cold War a little less predictable may be the same things if we could transport ourselves back to 1948 and think that way, not knowing what would happen in the future, we would also be worried about what the future held, because we would see, as we say we are seeing today, in 1948, we saw an aggressive Soviet Union ready to conquer and move forward all over the world simultaneously. That of course, not only did not prove to be the case, it was never even Stalin's intention to pursue Soviet influence through military means. He was not interested in expanding beyond the territories that the Soviet Union already controlled. And indeed, he tried, in the case of what the West saw as an aggressive action, the North Korean invasion of South Korea. We now know, because we have the historical documents, that the Soviet Union opposed that. But they couldn't control their ally at the time. And then it became a political issue, and China became involved, and became much more complicated on its own right. So that's what I think where we are today, looking forward. And we are likely, in the best of all possible worlds, to eventually find ways to coexist, peaceful coexistence. We will have strategies of peaceful coexistence. We will have strategies of détente. The thing that's ultimately missing, however, from where we are today compared to the old policies of the Cold War, is that there's no containment policy. We don't have a clear containment strategy. And the reason for that is that there isn't that ideological divide between Russia and ourselves that there was between the Soviet Union and the United States. In other words, the Soviet Union was indeed committed to a global transformation and to the end of the socioeconomic system in the West as it had existed. It didn't see the need to push that to a certain, to accomplish that by a certain date, but it was committed to that vision of the future. Russia's vision of the future is essentially no different from that of the West and of the United States. In fact, it argues for a greater degree of individual pluralism among countries, a multipolar world rather than one that is bound to a Western, a rules-based order defined by the West. So it wants actually greater diversity than what the West wants now. And this puts it in a much more attractive position with respect to many countries outside of the United States and its allies and Europe. So we have here, to some extent, in the new Cold War, a bit of a recreation of what Samuel P. Huntington warned us about, and that he termed the clash of the West against the rest, which will be a clash of civilizational vision, of which the strongest component in foreign policy will be how to create a world order that is actually peaceful and stable. But I would say on both sides, we have inklings as to what that might be, but no clear, definitive policy statement, no single document like Kennan's article, which he wrote as X in Foreign Affairs about the origins of Soviet expansion. There's nothing that definitive. So people will be throwing out ideas, but it doesn't look like there will be as much consistency as there was in the old Cold War policy at first, at least.
You talk about rules-based international order. In your opinion, what does it mean? Why we don't have law-based international order? What's the difference, in your opinion, between these two terms, and who made these rules, and who's gonna obey these rules?
Well, the difference, as many international relations theorists have pointed out, is that the law-based order refers to the UN charter-based system. This is a term that Professor Richard Sakwa in Britain, I think, very correctly points out. The rules-based order was one based on the UN Charter, and the UN Charter was meant to be and remains the foundation for international law. And it does not allow nations to take really the initiative on their own in defining what is right and what is wrong. It presumes to create for international action a consensus among states, most vitally among the most important and powerful states, who will then be in a position to gather around them and enforce, with the support of the larger international community, this international consensus. And at a very minimum, what restricts this consensus from acting in the interests of any one nation or any one group of nations is the fact that it is based on a set of legal principles that have to be acknowledged by all. The rules-based order that is now being promulgated by the West is something very different. It is the West substituting its values and its interpretation of international law for the whole. And if you are on board with this, then you are good in the eyes of the members of the rules-based international order. And if you are not, then you are illegitimate, again, in the eyes of the international rules-based order. But this is not the international community. Although US and Western political politicians and spokesmen often try to confuse the two by saying rules-based and then adding the caveat, this is what the world wants. This is the international community speaking, but it is not. And the distinction between the two is very clear. Part of the legitimacy of the rules-based order, which would seem to be simply a justification of acting in the interests of the major global power, which is the United States, is that it is also a liberal international order. We have, since in the West, tended to avoid the use of the term liberal because there are clearly so many aspects of the rules-based order, including global censorship, including global sanctions, especially on third-party countries, all sorts of constraints that are so obviously not liberal or that violate the premise of a liberal international community, that it is hard to be able to talk about the rules-based order as a liberal order. And so I think we've simply abandoned it.
Yeah, just to wrap up this session, Nikolai, I want to know what's your take on neocons, because when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, in Middle East, in Taiwan, they always talking about neocons are responsible for these kind of policies. The right says it's the left, left says it's the right, and it's so amazing to see we have neoliberals and there are part of these neocons right now. And when you see these neocons, do they have any sort of party affiliation with when it comes to the left and right, or there's something so in the center that they take two parts, the left and right, together, and they shape the left and right in their benefit?
Neoconservatism refers first and foremost to a foreign policy doctrine and a constituency in the foreign policy establishment of the United States. There may be echoes of this in domestic politics, but it is separate from the discourse that neoconservatives have with regard to American foreign policy. Most simply put, and this ties in with what we were just talking about, neoconservatives have no ideology in terms of left and right. What unites them, be they on the left domestically or on the right domestically, in terms of domestic politics, what unites them is the devotion to American primacy in the world and to the idea that this constitutes an overarching value. It is valuable on two levels simultaneously for neocons. One, it is valuable for the United States. It is a benefit that we get in terms of, as a result of dominating global affairs, we can make the world safer and more prosperous for ourselves, for the way we interact with other countries. We can get them to do what we want. But secondarily, and they may not recognize this, but we already do in the United States, is that this is good for them in the long run. So the ideology that unites neocons in the United States, and has for a number of years, is the idea of the rules-based order. The rules-based order, again, fulfills both of those missions. On the one hand, it is good for America. As Trump would say, it makes America first. It puts America first. But also on the liberal side, it's easy to be a neocon because it promotes the kind of values that benefit the United States and the kind of rules of order in the world, democracy, human rights, etc., that the United States also ultimately benefits from. And if one of the curious things that neocons refuse to acknowledge is that there is any tension between American primacy and American interest in human rights. And if there is any tension, then American primacy takes priority over our support for human rights. And we can always come back to those human rights later. We can take care of those with the next person that we put in power in some third world country or that we promote. It is far more important for a neoconservative approach to foreign policy to keep America first globally in its ability to influence world affairs.